Hey, welcome. We got a nice crowd here tonight. Must be the good weather. So I want to welcome all the members and the guests, and we got a Zoom audience also. And this is, of course, our May program. I happen to be the president of Squirrel Hill Historical Society. I kind of stay in Florida a few months, so I'm back. I got back just after the storm, by the way. What a mess that was. Okay, this program is being recorded and will be uploaded to the Squirrel Hill History.org website. And anybody can watch all the past videos and programs on that website. We have a member-only section that is password protected, and those people can view all the past newsletters on that site. But membership, if you're not a member, is only $15 a single and $25 a couple, and that's for a year. And we want to thank all the members as they afford Squirrel Hill Historical Society to continue to offer all these programs and the Zooms and the new equipment we need to keep this thing running. So we want to thank you for all that. Now, we had a board meeting on April 17th, and we have filled all of our officer vacancies. We had a couple vacancies there. We were having a hard time filling them, but they are all filled now. Like I said, I'm president of the Squirrel Hill Historical Society. Helen Wilson, she's over here, over there. She's our vice president. Tony Inavina down here, he's an email coordinator. And also president of the Neil Log House. And you'll say a few words about that later. Todd Miller, he's down there, okay, and Toby Chapman. These are program coordinators. They put all these nice programs together. Stanley Klein, he's our membership coordinator. We got Charles Sukop and Todd Wilson, he's over there. Yep. They do a lot of our research. Evelyn Young is our past treasurer. She was the treasurer forever, and she has retired, but she's still a board member. And we're glad to have her stay here, but she tends to travel now and everything. So now we have a new treasurer, Rod, right there. Permagani, right? I get it close. Yeah, I'm sorry. He stepped up and took the treasurer position. We appreciate that. And then we have a new board member, Alex Buscant. And he's going to be a Zoom assistant with technology. And I think he's going to do the program announcements and help Tony out with a lot of his things he was doing. And another longtime board member, manning the camera back here, our media specialist is Audrey, and she going to be our recording secretary. So that filled off our positions. And now Helen's going to say a few words, and then Tony's going to follow, and then Todd will introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Just a few quick words. And first of all, I want to acknowledge two people who help us out every meeting. My sister Agnes, and my Drew and I go all the way back to college, but they work our information tables, so thank you very much for that. And the two things I wanted to talk to you really quick is we've been working on the Shenley Park City Designated Historic nomination because Frick Park has city designation, Mellon Park does, but Shenley doesn't. So it's in progress. It is now our nomination form, which I wrote, and Preservation Pittsburgh, Matthew Falcone helped finalize it, and it is now on the city website if you want to see what's involved. So that was a major accomplishment. And the other thing is that Tony and I met with our CMU intern yesterday, and she's going to be working on our new book, which will be The Roads of Squirrel Hill, all 212 plus roads of Squirrel Hill, where their names came from, where they are, why they were put there, and just a description of them, and how they show the development of this community. So we're really excited about that. That's our summer project. And now I'll turn the mic over to Tony.
Very quickly, after 3.5 years of planning, the Friends of Neil Log House is pleased to announce that we are in our programming phase. We're into the second week of it. We started our collaboration with City Parks and Recreation. We have a park ranger, Ranger Emily, who is the face of the Neil Log House 3 days a week. PittsburghPA.gov, click on Neil Log House, and you'll see the schedule every month. And you'll see a place where if you want to schedule a private group tour, you could do that. Otherwise, you're welcome to drop in during open hours 3 days a week. So come up and spread the word. Okay.
Thank you, Tony, and good evening, everyone. I'm Todd Miller, program co-scheduler for the Historical Society, as Jim mentioned, and my partner in crime is Toby Chapman, who's right there in the front row. So thank you, Toby, for your help in getting the speakers. So our speaker this evening is Rob Ruck, a professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh, and he'll discuss a book that he co-authored with his colleague Ted Muller, who couldn't be here tonight. The book is titled Pittsburgh Rising, From Frontier Town to Steel City, 1750 to 1920. And it tracks the evolution of the city from a frontier town that came into being as a result of the Great War for Empire between England and France, all the way to the Steel City of the 1920s. Rob has written dozens of books on a variety of subjects, and in 2006 he was a member of the Baseball Hall of Fame's balloting committee on African American baseball to select a large number of Negro League players to the Hall of Fame. So at this time, it's my pleasure to introduce Rob Ruck.
Thanks, Todd. Appreciate that introduction. I appreciate you all coming this evening and inviting me. Ted Muller, regrettably, can't be here this evening. As he put it, radiation and physical pain have sent me to the bench. So I'm going to talk for 40 minutes, and if I get to 40 minutes, I'm just going to cut it off there no matter where I am and open things up to Q&A. I know that many of you have spent much of your lives in Pittsburgh, so what I want to talk about probably won't be that surprising. Pittsburgh, like many urban centers, faces an array of problems right now. Whether it's the fragility of the central business district, a stagnating population, lack of affordable housing, or the chaos in Washington where the know-nothings seem to be doing their best to destroy the Eds and Meds economy. These are challenging times. Some see Pittsburgh as mired in crisis, without a proactive plan for the future. And I think there's some truth in that. But crisis has long been part of Pittsburgh's story. When Ted and I began to look at the history of Pittsburgh with this book in mind, we saw a lot of crises, a lot of conflict and controversy, but we also saw a great deal of resiliency. Since Pittsburgh emerged as a frontier town in the 1750s, it's gone through transitions and crises, but those crises provoke people to step forward and find solutions. This book began many years ago, back in the 1990s, over lunch with Peter Oresek, who was then the director of Pitt Press. Peter was a wonderful poet of working class life, and he suggested to me that I consider writing a history of Pittsburgh. And I thought, that's way out of my capabilities. And then one day in the history department at Pitt, I was talking with Ted Muller at the mailboxes, and told him what Peter had suggested, and he said, I've been thinking about doing that for some time. And we thought that maybe, just maybe, the two of us working together could pull it off. Besides, collaborating is a lot more fun than writing a book by yourself. We began talking about Pittsburgh over coffee, at basketball games, even at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. We didn't anticipate that it would take about 30 years to finish. It turned out to be the first volume of the book, but you know, things happen. We are working on a second volume, or at least Ted is. Pittsburgh Rising tracks the city's evolution from that frontier town that, as Todd said, came into being as a result of the Great War for Empire between England and France. We then traced through Pittsburgh's reinvention after the Revolution as the gateway to the West to a city, the Iron City, which James Parton described in Atlantic magazine as hell with the lid taken off, and ultimately the Steel City of the early 20th century. Every so often, protean Pittsburgh, as David McCullough put it, reinvented itself. And when that happened, there were usually winners and losers. Pittsburgh, I think, embodied the notion of creative destruction that the economist Joseph Schumpeter popularized in the 1940s. That innovation and technological change inevitably force areas that have lost their dynamism to go into decline, while other sectors or cities start to profit because they're more innovative, more profitable. That reinvention is perpetual in Pittsburgh's history, of losers and winners. Most recently, the deindustrialization that walloped the region in the 1970s and 80s, and then our reinvention with Eds and Meds. Now, it's not that understanding the past allows us to predict the future, but it does give us some sense of how people have dealt with things in the past, and I think it offers us a sense of hope, which we need these days. Now, I can't adequately try to describe a book that covers 2 centuries in 40 minutes, but I want to discuss a few things, beginning with 4 problems that took hold as the city emerged. Damage to the ecosystem, polarization between Pittsburgh as a city and its rural and then suburban hinterlands, inequality, and racial disparities. And I focus on those problems because they've been central to the city's history since the 1700s, and they haven't gone away. The first problem was how people dealt with the land. Motivated by survival, the people who came here, the early settlers, ignored how well indigenous peoples had served as stewards of the forest. Some settlers wanted little more than land that would provide their families with a way to subsist and a degree of freedom. Others raised forests to produce commodities for the marketplace, dug below the soil to extract coal, and used rivers as sewers to dispose of the waste products from mining and manufacturing. That damage would spiral out of control during industrialization, endangering the city's future during the 20th century. Still with us. A second problem, an enduring rift between the town and country, painfully evident in the 1790s when farmers who felt scorned by city folks and the federal government, then in Philadelphia, took up arms in what was known as the Whiskey Rebellion. Those farmers had not been doing well. They saw themselves as losing ground, and a federal tax on distilling grain to make whiskey, which was used as currency and part of people's wages, was the breaking point. In 1794, several thousand whiskey rebels, armed for battle, gathered at Braddock's Field near the Monongahela River, intending to march on Pittsburgh and burn it to the ground. Only some very smooth talking by Hugh Henry Brackenridge, who was the catalyst to the formation of Allegheny County, the city's first newspaper, and what became the University of Pittsburgh, saved the day. he persuaded the rebels not to destroy the city, which they blamed, along with the government, for their difficulties. After Breckinridge soothed the rebels, George Washington sent an army here that rather ruthlessly crushed the rebellion and forced many of the rebels to head west. But anti-government attitudes remained strong outside the city, and so did resentment of rural people towards city folks who they felt had it better than they did, who they saw as looking down upon them. The city was more diverse demographically and culturally. It made people feel anxious. If you look at voting patterns around here, it's clear that urban-rural divide still matters. You don't have to drive far from downtown Pittsburgh or Squirrel Hill to see that. And I think that that divide is a global tension driving much of the volatility, threatening democratic norms, not just in the United States, but around the world these days. A third issue that I don't think needs much elaboration was growing inequality, which grew more severe as the city grew. A financial, manufacturing, and commercial elite benefited immensely from the region's development. Working people, not so much. By the 20th century, the East End of Pittsburgh was one of the most affluent and powerful neighborhoods in the world. But far more people lived in dilapidated tenements with shared privies in the shadow of the mills. Finally, racial disparities. Ted and I knew of the problems that African Americans encountered during the 20th century, from the Great Migration on. What we were surprised about was the strength and intellectual vitality of an earlier Black Pittsburgh community in the 1830s and 40s. That was a time when Martin Delany, often called the father of Black nationalism, lived on the Hill. Slavery in Pennsylvania started to be abolished gradually in 1790, but slave masters still frequently passed through the city and brought their enslaved people with them. Not a good idea, because there was a network of activists, African Americans working in hotels and on the river, who alerted essentially what was an underground operation in Pittsburgh that would spring into action, free those people, and take them out of town. And whenever somebody was arrested and brought to trial for that, almost invariably, Pittsburgh juries acquitted them. But 1850, there was a far more existential threat to the Black community when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. It gave federal sanction to slave owners who were going about seizing African Americans, including people who were born and living free, and re-enslaving them on the flimsiest of evidence. And it made it possible to punish anybody who came to their defense. Sounds kind of eerily similar to what's going on today. That would destroy the Black community, because there was a very overnight exodus of Black men particularly who left Pittsburgh and headed north. Many ended up in Chatham in Ontario in Canada. The Black community was destroyed. That meant that community formation for African Americans was set back. It had to start again from ground zero after the Civil War. The Black community is going to triple in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, but it doesn't have that foundation that had been laid before. They had to keep rebuilding it. Meanwhile, the Black community that arrived during the Great Migration had very bad timing. They came in after the new immigrants from Central, Southern, and Eastern Europe had established themselves in the mills. The Black workers coming from the rural South during the Great Migration in World War I, last hired, first fired. They get assigned to the worst jobs with the least future in the mill. And unlike the European immigrants, they could not bequeath the occupational and residential legacy that people from Italy, Poland, Slovakia, and elsewhere could to their children and grandchildren. So Black Pittsburghers did not put down roots in the same way. Many moved on. The point I'm trying to make is that some of the problems we face today have been with us for a long time and keep reoccurring. Even as this region became the epicenter of manufacturing in this country by the early 20th century. Now, nearly a century and a half before Pittsburgh became a powerhouse, it was ground zero for imperial rivalries. Whoever controlled the headwaters of the Ohio River controlled access to the heartland of North America, which is why Great Britain and France were fighting so viciously for control of the point downtown. The Native Americans who roved through this region but were not inclined to settle permanently in one place paid the stiffest price. Europeans dismissed their humanity, and European disease ravaged the population, from which they had no resistance to those diseases. The town emerging at the point after England defeated France was isolated for a while by the Allegheny Mountains. But that isolation wore down, and Pittsburgh becomes affected by global economics and politics. And those forces shaped Pittsburgh, but so did its people, most of all, its people. And that's how we wrote Pittsburgh Rising, around people who drove its history. Well-known icons like Carnegie, Frick, Hines left their fingerprints all over Pittsburgh. But so did the people who built Pittsburgh with their hands, with their labor, even if they hardly made it into the footnotes until around the 1970s. Those European immigrants and black migrants left little behind that could be celebrated on a par with those titans of industry, but they laid the way for their descendants who worked in mines and mills, along the rivers as domestic servants, textile hands, and office workers to make Pittsburgh what it's become. A city where people worked hard and played harder, a community that became the backbone of America. Pittsburgh's elites and those who struggled to make it through the day had little in common in terms of the lives they lived, but they were inextricably connected. And there's no way to understand the history of this city by paying attention to one group and not the other. They both mattered, but they weren't always on the same page. In fact, they were often at each other's throats. Much of Pittsburgh's history is about conflict, about people who banded together to take control of the headwaters of the Ohio and then fought with each other over the profits, over wages, over working conditions, over civil and human rights. Some had a laissez-faire, social Darwinian view of capitalism. Others saw government as responsible for the greater good, a way to buffer the Wild West frontier town capitalism that developed. There were all kinds of conflicts between rural and urban during the Whiskey Rebellion, a nasty conflict between the native-born Protestants, they used to call this Presbyterian Valley, and the Irish Catholic immigrants who came in the 1840s and 50s, during which St. Paul's Cathedral was set on fire in 1851. That came in the wake of torch-lit processions, cross burnings, newspaper editors inciting anti-Catholic nativists to beat up priests and vandalize churches. Did you ever hear of Joe Barker? He was a street preacher. He riled up gangs in the Strip, calling the Sisters of Mercy whores, the priests whoremasters, and the Catholic Church no more than a whorehouse. His rants often provoked violence, which was his intention. And in 1850, after his 6th arrest for inciting to riot, he was actually convicted. While in jail, he won election as the city's mayor. 3-man race. There were fights over the rights and status of African Americans that continue to this day, animosity between the native-born and the new immigrants who arrived in the late 1880s, and a conflict that united almost everybody in the city against a corporate behemoth that they believed was taking advantage of them, the Pennsylvania Railroad, which was the most powerful economic concern in the country. That came to a bloody climax in 1877 when the state militia engaged in a very bloody two-day battle in which a couple of score people were killed when the militia was brought in from Philadelphia to put down a strike of railway workers. Much of the Strip in downtown Pittsburgh was on fire, and President Rutherford B. Hayes declared a state of insurrection, I think for only the second time in the history of the country. But the bloodiest conflict was the original conflict between indigenous inhabitants and settlers. Neither Ted nor I had ever heard of Kathakassa Blackhoof, whose granite statue I used to run by frequently in Shenley Park. Blackhoof fought against George Washington during General Braddock's fiasco in 1755. He later fought against U.S. forces after the Revolution. Finally, acknowledging U.S. supremacy, he encouraged the Shawnee people to coexist with the settlers. But predictably, the American Republic failed to deliver on its promises. Blackhoof's attempt to coexist was a path not taken. The reality was that most white people living in western Pennsylvania feared and loathed Native Americans, and the feelings were mutual. Neither thought it possible to live alongside the other. Because the settlers were the winners, they created the city in their own image, no place for anyone else. Unable to find a way to live with settlers, Blackhoof and most indigenous people moved on. The settlers, meanwhile, were intent on exploiting the land, rarely appreciating how well the Native Americans they displaced had conserved it. If they had, perhaps they wouldn't have scarred a pristine wilderness, fouled the air they breathed, tainted the water they drank. James Smith understood that indigenous way of life. He was just 18 in 1755. He was part of a road crew that was building a road by which General Braddock's army would try to attack Fort Duquesne, not the one that came up through Virginia. He and another guy are out on the road when suddenly they're ambushed by Kaufnawaga warriors. The man with Smith was shot dead. Smith thought he would have the same fate. Instead, the men who captured him ran him over 2 days to Fort Duquesne. He was taken there. He watched a number of other people who had been captive burned at the stake across the banks of the Allegheny River, but he was spared. And instead of being killed, he was adopted by the tribe, which, because of severe population loss, was often adopting people they captured and making them members of the tribe with full rights. For many, especially women, living among indigenous people was far better than the lives they enjoyed on the frontier, and they resisted repatriation. Smith became a member of the tribe, lived with them for about 4 years, sharing equally in their lives. He saw how they migrated with the seasons, leaving little imprint or damage on the land. And he gained a lot of respect for them, especially in how well they fought. But eventually, he wanted to return to his family because he understood Native Americans better than most settlers. He became a leader among backwoods Pennsylvanians, using what he learned during captivity to protect settlers from attack and fight the British during the Revolution. Kathakassa Blackhoof faded from memory, not Smith. A century after his death, he was rescued from oblivion in his 1937 biography that argued that the first act of rebellion in the War for Independence was a skirmish he led against the British in 1765. Predictably, RKO Pictures made a movie about it, and Allegheny Uprising. The years that he lived with the Kaufnawaga were totally ignored. In the 1930s, Native Americans had been savages beyond redemption. So RKO made Smith a part of America's heroic narrative what better way to do that than have John Wayne play him in the movie version. Fearless patriot, he tangles with arrogant British officers, defends the freedom from unprovoked attack by Native Americans. Now, have any of you heard of James Smith? If you're lucky, you have not watched Allegheny Uprising. But I bet a lot of you do remember Mike Fink. Mike Fink, born in a cabin outside Fort Pitt in 1770, was known as the king of the keelboatmen, according to the mythology, and he was the best well-known person in Pittsburgh, nationally, at that time. He was half horse, half alligator, could outfight, outdrink, outshoot, and outpole anybody on the river from Pittsburgh to New Orleans. Might not have been half horse, half alligator, but he probably could have outshot, outdrunk, and outfought anybody, and outpoled them in his time. Long after his death, he made it to Hollywood too. He appeared in Davy Crockett and the River Pirates, and several Walt Disney television shows that I grew up with. John Wayne didn't play Fink, but he played two other Pittsburgh characters. One was a fairly forgettable movie, even though Marlene Dietrich and Randolph Scott were in it, called Pittsburgh, in which Wayne played kind of a Henry Clay Frick knockoff, a coal man who wants to be a steel magnate. Not that great a movie, but I bet some of you remember the other movie that won an Academy Award with John Wayne as Maureen O'Hara, The Quiet Man, where Wayne plays a Pittsburgh-born and bred former prize fighter, a man forged in steel and pig iron furnaces so hot a man forgets his fear of hell, who returns to Ireland and falls in love with Maureen O'Hara. This is where I usually turn things over to Ted, but he's messing me up tonight, so let me go on. If Blackhoof, James Smith, Mike Fink, Whiskey Rebels reflected the early Pittsburgh history when it's a frontier town, then along come Thomas Mellon, Martin Delaney, the Carnegies, Miranda Hollander, and tens of thousands of Europeans and African Americans who came here in the 19th century as the city goes through a couple of transitions, ultimately the Steel City. People came for an obvious reason. They were hoping to improve their prospects. Most came freely, others came as indentured servants or as enslaved people with little choice in the matter. By the early 19th century, indigenous people were basically out of the picture. Now, a lot of settlers who came here gave it up. It wasn't working, and they headed to Kentucky and further west. But no matter how many people left, there were more people coming here, intent on making a better life. Some succeeded spectacularly, left a visible mark on the city. Think of the names of the parks, the streets, the schools. Others not so well. But they left a legacy too. A legacy of resilience, of survival, even though they didn't get mentioned in the historical record. Let me talk a little bit about two of them. Miranda Hollander and Andrew Carnegie. They personified the promise and peril of a manufacturing city. Miranda Hollander was far better known than Andrew Carnegie in 1848, but she faded from historical memory. Carnegie, of course, becomes ubiquitous. Both of them lived in Allegheny City, which was a separate city from Pittsburgh then, in the 1840s. Miranda Hollander, her mother, and her younger siblings dwelled in two poorly lit rooms that were stifling in the summer and freezing in the winter. Carnegie, his siblings, and his parents in a slightly better, but not that much better place on the north side. Miranda Hollander went to work in a textile factory at 5 in the morning in the summer, often stayed till 7 p.m. or later in the evening. She saw daylight on Sundays, during brief meal breaks, and maybe for a few minutes on her walk home. Carnegie, as a boy, worked in a different textile factory where he tended a boiler. The fumes sickened him, and he had nightmares about the boiler exploding, which had happened at a nearby factory. Miranda was her family's sole supporter. She kept her widow, mother, and 3 sisters alive, if barely. Andy's wages, too, went to supporting his family. In July 1848, they lived and worked near each other, but not for long. 1848 was a year of upheaval. Karl Marx is putting the finishing touches on the Communist Manifesto. Women are gathering in Seneca Falls, New York, to make a landmark statement about women's rights. And a teenaged Miranda Hollander takes an axe in her hands and swings it against the gate of the Penn factory, a textile mill in Allegheny City. She too sought rights for herself and those she worked with. The right to work less and live more, to have a healthier, longer, more fulfilling life than working dawn to dusk in a textile factory. Her co-workers, mostly women and very young girls, cheered as Miranda's axe shattered the gate. Their goal was to halt production, prevent mill owners from subverting a recently passed state law that passed a 10-hour workday, 6 days a week. 2,000 of them gathered behind her, rushed into the factory, chased away the few workers who had dared to break the strike, overwhelmed a sheriff's posse, and shut down the factory. Their strike was for shorter hours, which meant a longer, healthier life, for free time, to take a walk along the Allegheny, to learn how to read and write, to spend time with family, to do something other than work themselves to death. That was a forerunner to the struggle for the 8-hour day that finally, in the 1930s, became the law of the land. Until that strike, factory workers were putting in 72-hour weeks. There were 7 textile factories, about 5,000 workers. 2/3 of them were female. About 1/5 of them were 5 years old or younger. Those textile factories were depending on cotton grown by enslaved labor in the South and were the 3rd biggest industry in the city. Girls and women had been hired because the owners mistakenly thought they'd be more docile than male laborers. But they were anything but compliant, striking and protesting repeatedly. And it's easy to see why. Their conditions were atrocious. A Scottish-born physician testified before a state Senate commission, describing the families of textile workers crammed into tiny, crowded apartments without ventilation as, quote, among the poorest of the poor, in old frame houses where the atmosphere is peculiarly bad, highly impregnated with putrid miasma arising from the offal of a crowded and miserable population, unquote. The doctor argued that the bodies of the children were, quote, utterly and irreparably destroyed for life. They never acquired that buoyancy and hilarity of spirits common to children of their age. They were early attacked with rickets and rendered disabled, end quote. Their hands and fingers were mangled by the machines. Tuberculosis, skin disease, eye strain, nervous disorders were frequent companions. Not more than 1 of 3 textile workers was literate, because when they entered the factory, they never went to school anymore. You came to work 5 minutes late, you were docked 1/4 of your day's wage. Supervisors slapped and hit workers with straps. It's easy to see why Southern slave owners defended slavery, saying that the wage slaves of the North didn't have it any better and might have had it worse than the people they enslaved. If Miranda was 16 in 1848, she would have survived cholera outbreaks in 1832, 33, and 34, and if she had stuck around in Pittsburgh to 1855, another 5 cholera breakouts. Cholera hit working and poor people the hardest because of living conditions, insufficient diet, the lack of clean water and decent sanitation, and yet they were blamed for their misfortune by preachers and the better off. One Presbyterian minister preached that a cholera outbreak after the strike was punishment for the textile girls' rebellion against order, propriety, and virtue, that they had brought God's wrath down upon themselves. Finally, July 31st, 1848, with mill owners attempting to subvert the state law, they exploded in rage. They won the day, but Miranda and 16 other people were put on trial, convicted of rioting. Miranda then just left town, as did most of the people who were arrested with her, and disappeared to the Northwest Territories or Kentucky. I tried tracking her down. We could never find much about her. But they were the story of the day, and many people in Pittsburgh supported them, even if the judge and jury did not. Meanwhile, after months of being on strike without pay, the strike crumbled, and it would take a long time to get that 10-hour day. There's no evidence that Andrew Carnegie's father, Will, was in the crowd that day. He, his wife Margaret, and their children had arrived in Allegheny City from Scotland that summer. They had joined what was called the flitting, the Scottish migration. It took them 10 weeks to get from Scotland to Allegheny City, where Margaret's sister lived. Her husband, Will, was by then a broken man. They had been staunch radicals in Scotland, fighting for workers' rights and a charter of democratic rights, but the activism which had shaped their life had burned out by the time they arrived in Pittsburgh. Will was a third-generation weaver of fine damask linens and other creations that put him on a par with a skilled jeweler or a cabinet maker, but mass production and economic depression destroyed his way of life. He couldn't make a living at in Scotland. He never got back on his feet in Pittsburgh or overcame that depression. Margaret, destitute with a defeated husband and small children, took in sewing. And Andy, 12 years old when he arrived in Pittsburgh, went to work in a textile factory. Andrew Carnegie, though, would spearhead Pittsburgh's emergence as the epicenter of American iron and steel making and the nation's rise into industrial power. After he had been in Pittsburgh a while, he wrote an uncle in Scotland that while he sometimes wished to be back in Dunfermline, poverty would likely have been his lot there. Quote, "But here I can surely do something better," he said, "and if not, it will be my own fault, for anyone could get along in this country." Well, some people did, but most people did not do nearly as well. Andy, too, like Miranda, left Pittsburgh. He wanted a less polluted city. We know everything about his life. We know everything about the Fricks and the Hineses and the Westinghouses. But we don't know so much about people like Miranda. And for every rags to riches story, there were tens of thousands about them. And there wouldn't have been a Carnegie, a Frick, a Hines, a Mellon without them. Now, by the late 19th century, new waves of immigrants are arriving. How many of you have ancestors that came in the late 1800s, early 1900s? It remade Pittsburgh. These were the new immigrants, and they were treated just like the old Irish and German immigrants, which was pretty badly. They were part of a global rural to urban migration, remaking the world. About 12 million people came from the late 1870s to the United States through World War I. Now, immigrants tend to be a self-selecting, adventurous group, more willing to seek experiences than those who stayed in Europe. But they faced discrimination in the workplace, anti-immigrant sentiments, and about 30% of them went back, never really intending to do more than make some money here, go back, buy some land, open a store. There were also newcomers from the Black South, from the Black Belt, arriving first from Virginia and Maryland in the 1890s, and then from Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi later on. White immigrants, black migrants, held unskilled jobs in the mills. They went down in the mines. They made a go of it at a time when there was no safety net and working conditions were particularly dangerous. But they survived by sticking together, forming fraternal associations, churches and synagogues, ball clubs, and the informal networks that people need to get through it. We based much of the 20th century part of this book, actually from about the 1880s on three families. One was fictional, The Family from Out of This Furnace by Thomas Bell. How many of you have read that? A terrific novel of three generations of immigrant life from the Austrian and Hungarian Empire. The second family was a very real Carlino family, Augusto and Palmira Carlino. And there's been a Carlino in Pittsburgh, usually in Bloomfield, ever since. The third were William and Mamie Tinker, who left Alabama. Their parents had been born in slavery. They came to Pittsburgh and wound up on the Hill around World War I. Those newcomers added new layers to the mosaic, religiously, ethnically, and racially. And the choices they made, where to live, where to work, how to build something, who to vote for, whether to take their protests into the streets, shaped Pittsburgh just as did the powerful elite, the Carnegies, the Mellons, and the like. I mean, the East End of Pittsburgh, the poker game in H.C. Frick's house at Clayton had probably more money and power and influence than anywhere in the United States, if not the world, at that time. If we ever finish the second volume, we're going to pick up their stories, because they're impressive stories. Both excellence in terms of community building, Rivers of Steel, the Negro Leagues, Tinker and the Pittsburgh Crawfords, and the unions. Now, I'm probably close to my 40 minutes, if not over, so let me bring this to an end. By the early 20th century, Pittsburgh is among the most powerful and dynamic cities in the country, but there's stagnation and decline on the horizon. During the 19th century, the industrialist politicians and civic leaders were ill-prepared for what they would face. The dynamic, unfettered capitalism of the 19th century, which prized the private market, very limited government individualism, rewarded aggressive, innovative business people. And they built prestigious corporations, accumulated fortunes. Their descendants easily weathered decline. Less advantaged families had a harder time. Immigrants from Europe, migrants from the Black South, lived in grimy, polluted mill towns and city neighborhoods. They encountered inequality and racism with minimal government assistance and inadequate philanthropy. Many were more than victims, though. They fought back in the workplace, constructed communities on the cornerstones of their churches and fraternal societies, and displayed their talent and capacities in art, in culture, in politics, in sport. Those working class communities, rocked by deindustrialization, which devastated steel in the 70s and 80s, were hit hard. Few regions in this country were hit so hard. And yet, we saw recovery once again. We've also seen recovery, I hope it continues, for the region's woodlands and rivers, which suffered from unfettered industrial growth. They've displayed remarkable resiliency in county parks, in state forests, along the Youghiogheny. But the struggle over land continues. And as things turn grim in Washington in terms of attention to the environment, it's probably an existential moment for many of those forests and rivers. Anti-urban sentiment, I think, poses another threat. In outlying regions of Allegheny County, Fayette, Westmoreland, there is still a palpable distrust of government and the city, similar to what happened with the Whiskey Rebels. That's impaired cooperation that would allow this region to deal with problems on a more metropolitan basis. Those are some of the ways I think past was prologue in Pittsburgh. So let me end it there and just take your questions. Thank you. So who's got a question? Todd.
What is the way forward in dealing with our challenges, or are we doomed to repeat the past?
I don't think we're doomed to repeat the past. I'm not a seer, you know, and it's clear there are a lot of people whose hearts and minds, I believe, are in the right place, who are working on an array of issues. And you know, right now, I think there's a lot of discouragement. We just have to fight through that. I wish I had, you know, a 10-point plan, but I haven't had that in a long time.
When you have that rural-urban tension, did gerrymandering come up at all in your research?
It didn't, but you know, I think largely because of Mark Nordenberg, who was the deciding voice on the State Reapportion Committee, which included a very pragmatic Democratic head of the House and Republican head of the Senate, two women. I mean, we have a much fairer system than we once had. We're not North Carolina or a lot of places where it's really ridiculous. But that gerrymandering, I think, in the 20th century would have to be an issue because it's polarized politics in such a way that it makes the chance of compromise, finding common ground, a lot harder.
I'm curious from your perspective as an historian, how does Pittsburgh compare in its efforts to extend metropolitanism to the adjacent areas and communities versus other cities in the last few century time frame?
That would be a great question for Ted. I don't think we've done as well as a lot of areas. I mean, how many different townships and municipalities are there in Allegheny County? And, you know, we've got a lot of redundancy. And a lot of them just can't make it. And it's, you know, part of it is a resentment. For example, Allegheny City was separate, but the leadership in Pittsburgh got a bill passed through the state that allowed them to essentially absorb Allegheny City, even though Allegheny City didn't want to be absorbed, and there was lingering resentment. And I think we see how resentment and frustration fester. Barbara.
I'm just curious about government policies and government leadership and how that kind of affected the industrial, you know, just our growth and everything. It's something that I'm just thinking about now.
Once again, this is a question for Ted. If I can channel him. City government was pretty hands-off. It didn't do a lot. And it certainly didn't interfere with business interests. And I don't think you see a more activist government probably until the 1930s, and a lot of it has to do with David Lawrence. You know, we think of Pittsburgh as a very democratic city these days. In the late 20s, if I've got this right, and I think I do, there were 165,000 registered voters in Pittsburgh, 165,000. About 158,000 of them were Republicans. And then, with the crash, FDR, and the New Deal, it was reversed. But I think that's a great question for the second volume.
Yeah, actually, you want to give Charlie Klein some credit for that, and FDR. But I haven't read your book again, but do you touch on Cumberland Posey? Not the senior, not the junior.
Yeah. Cumberland Posey Sr., Commodore Posey, was the first African American to get a license on the river as a steamboat engineer. He became an entrepreneur, Diamond Coke and Coal Company, did business with Andrew Carnegie. And he's part of an earlier wave of migration from the Shenandoah Valley to Pittsburgh, which was a very literate, high-cultured black population that led to a lot of people getting skilled jobs. For blacks, an anomaly at the Homestead Steelworks. His son, Cumberland Jr., who was this all-around athlete, the greatest black athlete, all-around athlete in the city, who went to Holy Cross, later Duquesne, Penn State, played for the Homestead Grays, which had been formed by skilled black workers, and became their captain, manager, and then owner. But he grew up, with Captain, the Commodore, who played an important role, I think, in the black community at the time.
Yeah, just one quick follow-up. There's a thing that I come across where a senior was sort of suckered into a crime by an opposing steamship company. And he was sent to the workhouse for about a year. And he somehow, again, he had enough, again, I guess, connections, political connections. He got out within a year. And I thought that was remarkable for a black individual in those days.
That's a great story I was totally unaware of.
I can follow up on that.
Jules?
Two questions. One is, why was it that such a high percentage of Pittsburghers were Republican in 1928 or whatever? That's number one. And number two, this gets to your wheelhouse. What do you think the relationship between the rise of Pittsburgh as an industrial city and the rise of sports in Pittsburgh?
Pennsylvania was about the most Republican state in the Union in the early 20th century. And the Democratic Party was weak. I mean, in 1924, I think it was, La Follette, the progressive candidate, came in second, and the Democratic candidate, Al Smith, came in third in Pittsburgh. And a lot of it had to do with Republican politics in Pittsburgh. Maggie Patterson, my wife and co-author with the biography of Art Rooney, heard a lot about this. But Republican politics were a combination of the Mellons, the Duquesne Club elite, and they were the people in the wards were led by State Senator James Coyne, who was this kingpin out of central casting. And Republican, the Union people were Republican. The ward people were Republican. There really was no Democratic Party till the big switch, and a lot of Republicans became Democrats when that happened. But I think it was, the influence in the state of big money, Pennsylvania Railroad particularly. I mean, think of the Homestead Strike, where the corporate elite gets the governor to bring the militia to Homestead to break it, and it lingers. Your second question, the connection between industry and sport. Industry attracted a really diverse group of people to Pittsburgh who had pretty lousy lives in the mills. I mean, people worked in the mills till World War I, worked 7 12-day shifts a week. They got off every other Sunday, but to compensate that, they had to work 24 hours in the opposite day. Finally, when hours go down a bit, workers have free time, and they start teams. They often have played for factory teams. They played for teams representing settlement houses, teams backed by rich people and politicians and numbers writers. And I mean, this city, this region between World War I and World War II had 300 to 400 independent sandlot baseball teams each year, and about 80 football teams. Black, white, Italian, you name it, Jewish, second story Morris. And I think that it was a great release. It was a part of life that they controlled. And when you control something, and you don't control much of the rest of your life, what you do control, you prize even more. And they were really good at it. And I think for a lot of immigrants and black migrants, sport provided a vehicle to become Pittsburghers. Just as sport would be a dynamic of Americanization by and large in this country. And those teams took hold, and these working class kids like the ones who formed the Hope Harveys on the north side of Pittsburgh. Hope was the firehouse they used as a locker room. Harvey was the doctor who took care of them. Art Rooney was their founder and creator. The Hope Harveys became the Steelers. The Homestead Grays, one of the two great Negro League teams from Pittsburgh, started as a bunch of skilled black workers at the Homestead Works. The Crawfords were the sons of migrants during World War I who got their name from the Crawford bathhouse. So I think, industry, working hard, seeing sport as fun, and eventually, for some, a means of uplift, part of life they controlled.
So here we are in the 1850s, say. What alternative did Pittsburgh have to become a great city other than the polluting industries?
Yeah, Pittsburgh's edge early on, that gateway to the west, was the Allegheny Mountains, because it was very hard to get stuff across the Alleghenies. So if you could manufacture things in Pittsburgh, all the people who were heading down the Ohio, Mississippi, market. But eventually you got places downriver, and they cut into Pittsburgh's business. So you're right. I mean, it's hard to find a way to reinvent yourself. And the two big pre-war industries, textiles third, it's iron and glass. And both were really tough. I mean, glass blowers, they had to shut down the glass factories in the summer because of the heat. You can imagine blowing glass. Glass blowers, by the way, were great rowers. And there were 40 or 50 boathouses in Pittsburgh with these teams of glass blowers. But yeah, I mean, people scrambled. And iron caught on, as did steel, in part because of geography. You've got great coal that can be made into coke. You've got access on the rivers and the Great Lakes to the Mesabi Iron Range. And you've got some pretty interesting entrepreneurs, Jones, Laughlin, Oliver, Carnegie, and the like. We pay a price.
What do you think, like the current theory now, was supposed to bring all these manufacturing facilities back? Obviously, the working conditions would be different, but why did they think people will want to go back to working in factories?
Frankly, I think the thought of reindustrializing Pittsburgh with bringing the mills back,
Yeah.
I think it's ridiculous. How many of you have been on the Great Allegheny Passage bike trail? If you go, past Homewood towards McKeesport, you see some of the renovated and revitalized places. You see things which are still in collapse, and you see all these where there had been amazing factories. I mean, I think the Mon Valley might have been the most intense, concentrated cluster of manufacturing in the country at the time. And even if you had those mills producing, it'd be computers, and computer techs producing. It's not gangs of unskilled labor. So I think one of the really disturbing things about what's going on is the impact right now on Eds and Meds, which have been so important to this region. And they offer a better future for people. And they're being hammered. We just have to get through it, I think. Well, thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Rob, for your insights, and look forward to having you back on another occasion when you bring copies of your book. So when is the book, or when will that be available
The book's
again?
available, I mean, obviously online, probably the Pitt bookstore. I'm not sure if the Squirrel Hole bookstore is carrying it. But Co-op, I'm not sure where else. Barnes and Noble, I believe, it's out in paper now. I'm sorry I wasn't able to bring copies.
There's a copy. And we thank you for being here this evening. And next month, June 10th, Tuesday, June 10th, our program is going to be led by co-authors Jim Wodarczyk and Joanne Cantrell. They wrote a book on Pittsburgh's orphans and orphanages. It focuses on those institutions in the 19th and early 20th century. So we hope you're here for that. So again, thank you for being here, and have a safe trip home, and hope to see you next month.